Alright, welcome back, and I want to talk about functions. And functions are methods. We'll talk about the difference between those two terms later on, but let's get used to writing functions and how we can use them in our program. So let's create a new class inside our basics package, right? We'll create a new class, and I'm going to call this, numbers calc. How about that? Hit finish. Okay, so here's our numbers calc, and here's what I want to do. Inside our class, I want to have a couple of functions, right? I want to have a function that will, let's say, print name, right? And so we'll do a print name function. How about we do one that does add numbers, okay? And we'll do something called, how about multiply numbers, okay? So these three lines I've added here. Now I'm getting all kind of red squiggles here, but these are just three methods I want to have inside my class. Okay, now to call these, right? These are all just going to sit there. Now to call these, I need to go inside my public static void main string args. And there we go. So here's my main, right? So I need to enter in the main, and from the main, now we can call these other functions. Okay, so how do we declare a function or write a function, right? So we want this to be, I'll get to this keyword later, but I'm just going to say static void. Okay, so static void print name. Okay, so that's going to give some declaration into this function itself, and so we'll say here, when we call this function, I'm just going to print here, my name is Tim. Okay, now I'm going to comment this other stuff out here so we can at least run our main application. Now to comment this out, we're not getting any errors, so now I can just call print name. Okay, so this line is going to go call this function right there. So if I hit run, here we go, my name is Tim. Okay, now if I don't call that function, right, so I have here to say system out.print, we'll say program is starting, right? All that gets executed is this line. Although this function exists, we never call it, we never invoke it, right? So we actually need to go call that function, even though it's sitting there. Java will only exist and reside inside this main function unless we call something outside of it. So that's why, again, if we comment this out, it's not going to call our print name function. Okay, let me uncomment that. There we go. Okay, so we have our print name function. So let's say we want to add some numbers, right? So here we were just calling a function, doing some work and getting out, and we didn't pass anything. But let's say we wanted to call the add numbers function. Right, so let's uncomment this, call static void. Okay, so I want to call this function, but I want to pass, let's say I want to add numbers, so this function will add two numbers. Okay, let's get these two numbers from this method, right? So from our main, let's pass, actually let's say here, integer, we'll say a, or num a equals 10, integer num b equals 20. Okay, so now we have these variables. Let's pass these variables into these arguments. So we're going to pass num a and num b to this function add numbers. Now if we're going to pass them, we need to receive them, right? So here's this function. We're going to receive the numbers num a and num b. How we do that? We have the variable type, which is an int, right? So integer num a is an int, so we need num a. So we'll say number a, just to make it more clear. And then our second parameter is going to be integer number b. So these two variables are going to correspond with the arguments which were defined right here. Okay. So we're going to add two numbers, so we're going to say integer sum equals number a plus number b. And we will print the sum of numbers, and then let's make this clear here. Numbers, number a, of numbers, number a, plus, let's do and, number b is, and then we'll add the sum. Okay, very good. And we'll concatenate, or we'll comment this out here. So now we should have no errors in our program. What we're expecting to see is this program starting. It's going to call the print name function, and it's called the add numbers function after that. That add numbers is going to take two numbers and then add them together and print the result. Here we go. Sum of numbers 10 and 20 is 30. Okay, very good. And lastly, so here we have a function we're calling. We're passing no parameters. We're just doing some work. We have another function that we're calling. We're passing a couple of parameters here. And we have one more function. We're going to call this static. And instead of returning void, so void means we're not going to return anything, right? So you've seen this void a couple of times. Void means we're going to do some work and get out. There's going to be no return. For multiply numbers, let's have this be an int, right? So what we're going to do is do some work, and we're actually going to return a value. So let's call multiply numbers and then pass num a and num b again. Okay, there's an error because if you hover over, the method multiply names in the numbers calc is not applicable for the arguments int. Okay, meaning, what does this mean? We are passing two integers right here, but we are not receiving those here, so there's a mismatch, right? There's not applicable for the arguments that's being passed to it. So we need to handle this. So we're going to say integer, again, number, just use a different word here. Let's just say value a and integer value b. Okay. All right. Okay. And we want to say integer, the product is what it's called, equals value a times value b. Okay, so we have our product. Now what we need to do is return that value. We'll say return product. Okay, so what this keyword does return is it's going to take this value and give that back to this expression in this function, right? So this function is going to evaluate. It's actually going to be simplified to this integer value, which we're going to pass product into it. So, for example, we can say integer product equals that function. So, in other words, notice here we're calling a function, but here we are actually setting something equal to a function, because this is going to evaluate to a number, right? So we could even just say, sysout, and we can even just call that function right there in and of itself, right? Because this is a number, right? It's not work. It's not code. It's going to actually simplify to a number. So if I run this, there we go, 200, which is 10 and 20. So we could say here the product of numbers, we'll say num a and num b is, there we go. So we can run this, there you go, 1020 is 200, right? We can also set this equal to a variable, right? So we can say integer product equals, which this is what we had just a moment ago, equals this function, right? So we can do this and then comment this line out, and now instead of equaling it to a function, I'm going to equal it to that variable which we just defined. So either of them will work because it's basically the same thing. And there we go. Okay, so one other thing about functions, right? So we have functions with no parameters, no return type, function with parameters with a return type, a function that has a return type with parameters. We can also call functions from functions, right? So we can say, we can also say, like for example, if we're in the add numbers, right? It's a multiply numbers. We can call the add numbers function, and we can do products, right? So this is one way of doing it, right? We can call this function from anywhere, right? So what are we doing now? We're calling the multiply numbers function. Once we're in that, we're getting the product of A and B. Then we're calling the add numbers function and passing the product, which is 200 and 200. So we can do all kinds of things. You can even add separate things, right? You can do values within your test or within your application. So try around and just get familiar with calling functions and writing functions, having return types, not having return types, passing parameters, and so forth. So that's the gist of how we can write functions. We'll be very familiar with this later on because we'll use it quite a bit, and so you should be comfortable with writing functions with return types and parameters. So we'll see you in the next tutorial.